Welcome to another striper season update brought to you by West Marine. Big fish are still in northern New Jersey, but the biomass is definitely moving north. Right now is a great time to be targeting those big fish in Long Island, Connecticut, and Rhode Island as well. The action has been concentrated around bunker schools, so the bite can be a bit on and off, but topwater's the first light, live bunker throughout the day, and for the shore-based anglers, fishing at night has been the ticket. This week has also brought the first 40-inch class fish to the North Shore of Massachusetts, so right now is definitely a great time to be on the water, especially with a long weekend. It's also a great time to start logging more inches in Striper Cup. We're in week 4 right now, and for the long weekend, we have a very special arrangement of prizes for you this week. We're picking a total of 6 winners this week, our most ever. As always, we have the Costa Sunglasses photo contest and the West Marine Youth Catch of the Week. But we're also giving away a Bubba prize pack, a Columbia package for men and women, and a Yeti Hondo chair. Plus, you're gonna have all weekend to fish. This week, we're gonna close at Tuesday at noon, so you can fish up until Monday night at midnight and still enter those fish. We've given away a ton of weekly prizes so far, but we're only in week 4 of 20, so there's still plenty of time to sign up and join the Striper Cup and get your sign-up package too. While the striper fishing has been good, we have seen some interesting submissions lately with some fish that have, we'll call them irregularities. But I'll let Jimmy Fee and Kevin Blinkoff talk about it in this week's Striper Season Update.
So we get a ton of pictures of striped bass throughout the course of the season. A lot of them, big ones, small ones, and every once in a while, kind of a, let's call it a weird one. One of the ones we had recently was sent in by Sean Barnum, who is a kayak fisherman from Connecticut, and it was a pug nose striped bass. And if you've never seen one, it's exactly what it sounds like. We'll share Sean's post here. But Kevin, just to describe a pug nose striper, what's it look like?
So a pug nose striper, that's a deformity that seems to be, I wouldn't say it's common, but we'll see a few pictures of them every year. And it's a deformity where it's like the face of the striper is sort of pushed in, kind of like a bulldog. So if you kind of imagine a cross between a bulldog and a striped bass, it's got an underbite, not much of a top lip, and we never see a really big one. So I don't think that it's a very I don't think that it's helpful for striped bass for their survival. I don't think they get to be very big with that kind of a mouth. But, it's something that we see. And, Sean's is maybe one of the biggest pug nose bass we've seen. Definitely a weird looking fish and something that makes you pause if you pull one up. I've never caught one myself.
Yeah, I've had one, and it's a much smaller mouth than you see on your normal striped bass. A normal striper where the mouth is almost the same circumference as the entire head. And with a pug nose, it's much smaller, which is probably why they don't get, it must really inhibit their feeding. They're kind of cute in a hideous way, like the Gremlins.
Your kids. And it's not only striped bass too. I've seen it in other fish as well. It seems to be a deformity that can kind of pop up in all different fish species. But for whatever reason, we see it in striped bass. And like I said, it doesn't seem to necessarily kill them. They can survive that deformity and live that way. But on the other hand, they don't seem to get very big with it. I think at some point it just becomes a limiting factor. Can't really have a long life like that. I read a little bit about it online, and it's not an entirely genetic deformity. It has something to do with environmental conditions. So it happens in the embryonic stage. So while they're developing in the egg before they hatch, they kind of develop this deformity. And they say it's not entirely genetic because they've done studies where they've looked at identical twin striped bass. And you'll have identical twin striped bass, and one has the pug nose deformity and one does not.
I didn't even know there could be striped bass identical twins. They all kind of look identical.
I think they found out they were identical twins in the egg, like they looked at them that way versus look for two twins out in nature. Who knows?
Well, so there's pug nose stripers. Another one that happens, and I did some reading about it, is where you have a bass and it almost looks like its back has been broken. I've seen people post these photos and said this fish must have had a tremendous injury at some point. You can see it's kind of crooked, and it goes throughout the fish. It almost looks like a slight Z in the fish. And what that actually is a form of scoliosis in fish. We've seen it in white perch. It happens in a few different species, but I've caught a few stripers like that. Same story as the pug nose bass. They get, a 26-inch is a big one.
Yeah, and it can be sort of like a lateral curve to it. So that's more like scoliosis, where the fish is kind of like S-shaped. And then they call it lordosis if it's shaped like you're describing, which seems to be more common, of kind of like the back of the fish goes up and down, sort of almost like a Z shape that way. And again, they're just like you said, it's a birth defect. It's a spinal deformity. Again, probably something that happens in development, not just striped bass. It seems to be, like you mentioned, happens in white perch. I've seen pictures of hybrid freshwater stripers that also have that same condition, and then trout as well, which I think probably happens quite a bit with hatchery raised fish, because you're changing the conditions and things like that. You can sometimes end up with that kind of deformity as well. And like you mentioned, not the best shot at survival there. They don't tend to get too big.
Yeah, and that's another one where they said could be some environmental factors in that one as well, either at the larval stage or while they're in the egg. It's amazing how susceptible the fish are to pollution and other things like that at that stage. Going back to the 1960s, I know one of the reasons I read in the book Striper Wars, which was kind of about the previous collapse of the striped bass population, how DDT, which was that pesticide that they used, was also contributing to the crash of striped bass. How that eggs that were exposed to that didn't have the oil in them that helped them stay neutrally buoyant, which would really hurt the striped bass.
Yeah, unlike mammals, or that'll develop inside the womb and you have a little more protection. Striped bass eggs, fish eggs, they're just out there in the environment, rolling around in the water, so a little more susceptible to environmental conditions, pollution, and things like that. It's one of the reasons that environmental conditions are so important. Taking care of our environment, taking care of the water quality in the Chesapeake and other places where striped bass spawn, nursery grounds like that, so important to the health of the fish species.
A much more common kind of striped bass malady that we see starting around this time of year as the water temperature gets warmer and as these Chesapeake fish start to arrive is you see some fish with red sores on the sides. And one of the things that can be, although it's not the only thing it can be, is a disease called mycobacteriosis. Kevin, I know you know a lot more about that than I do.
A little bit. And so it's fairly common for fish, striped bass or any other kind of fish, to get different kind of skin diseases, infections, areas where they'll lose scales and it looks reddish, and you can just tell there's something not quite right with the fish there. And there's many different types of bacteria that can infect it. One of the ones that has gotten a lot of press with striped bass is Mycobacteria, which causes mycobacteriosis. Now, there's many, many different types of mycobacteria. So just because it has, say, mycobacteria in the sores doesn't mean it's necessarily the mycobacteriosis that made news in striped bass. In this one particular species of mycobacterium that infected striped bass in the Chesapeake and turned out, it can turn out to be fatal, that tends to affect the organs, the spleen, and then from there will sometimes show itself and kind of come out in the skin of the striped bass. So that's something that, is a concern in the striped bass population. But every time you see a red sore on a fish, that does not necessarily mean it's this particular fatal infection. So we did see, you mentioned Chesapeake fish. Fish in the Chesapeake, they're down there, they're spawning, they're in very warm water. They go through a lot of stress in the spawn. They actually go through physical, they bump up against each other, rub against each other in a fish spawning way.
That's kind of necessary. Huh?
It's part of the process. And so they'll rub off some slime, some scales. They'll get a little beat up, and then they're in that warm water as well. And then they swim and they migrate through the ocean. So there's a lot of stress involved there. And so it's understandable that they would get some sort of skin infections. And we see that a lot of times. We'll see big groups of what are clearly, spawning class, post-spawn striped bass show up, most likely from the Chesapeake, and they do have red sores on them. They're probably infected, probably bacteria in there, might be mycobacteria, but that does not mean that it is the mycobacteriosis we've heard about, which is this potentially fatal, concerning disease in striped bass. And so one of the biggest messages that we always hear from state biologists and anyone else is, don't ever think to yourself, oh, I'm doing the fish a favor. This has a disease. I should remove it from the population. Follow regulations. Don't keep a striped bass if it's not legal to keep, of course, and don't keep a striped bass because to you think it has a disease that could be infectious. Most of the time, these fish, they're going to recover. They're going to heal as the season goes on later in the year. A lot of times you see these fish that have started to heal from springtime infections. So Yeah, the other thing you need to be careful of is some of this bacteria that you find on fish can sometimes be transmitted to people. There's a bacterial infection called fish handler's disease, for example, that's caused by a bacteria. So if you do see, if you have a striped bass, it has open sores, looks infected, like, I would try not to handle that fish a lot. Definitely, wash your hands a lot, have some hand sanitizer out on the boat. If you have open cuts or anything on your hands, be super careful on that. And if you see any sign of infection in a cut or anything on your hands, if you have a sign of infection after fishing, definitely get it looked at quickly, because if it is this fish handler's disease, if it is this, we've seen where that can spread very quickly. In a matter of 24 hours, you're hospitalized on IV antibiotics. So definitely keep an eye on that and be careful.
Every year, or not every year, but some years, there's enough of these fish that with red sores that you see being caught. It ends up people post about them on social media or on some of the striper message boards online. And sometimes you see people advocating like, oh, you're doing the fish a favor if you cull them out of the population, thin the herd that way. And since it's not, there's no way just to look at the skin and know that that's going to be mycobacteriosis. It's going to be this really detrimental disease to stripers. So don't do that. Don't just kill a fish to think you're doing a favor by taking a wounded one out of the population. It's not going to, all you're doing is, you could be killing one that's perfectly healthy and just has a couple cuts and scrapes from the spawning process.
I approve that message. Oh, what about that striped bass picture we got sent in, the one with the tumor on him?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, another one we got recently was a striped bass that had a large bump right on the end of its nose. Almost looked like a rounded off horn, or people said they should call it a unicorn. Stripers get all kinds of crazy diseases, and I guess that could be a tumor. What do you think that was?
Yeah, I'm guessing that was some kind of tumor, and you see that a lot on different fish sometimes. Fish people, everybody gets growths and weird things. That was the first time I've seen something like that was so dead center that it looked kind of like a rhinoceros horn. But yeah, you'll see that sometimes, different bony growths or tumors on a fish. Sometimes it could be a cyst. There could be that there was a parasite there that the sort of immune response of the fish is to encapsulate it and form that kind of a lump. Yeah, I'm no fish veterinarian, but I got to imagine it was something like that. And fish seem to be doing all right. And I don't know if the other fish make fun of him or what, but he's living his life.
One of the most interesting things to me about stripers, too, is their stripe patterns. Some of them have completely unbroken stripes, and then you'll get into some where they have broken stripes. The most extreme example we posted on Instagram last year, we'll put that up there. And that was a striper where, it looked like somebody scrambled them all up. There was no discernible stripes. It looked like a weak fish pattern on it almost. I've heard people say, and I have my doubts, that it's the Chesapeake fish that have the perfectly straight stripes and the Hudson fish that have the broken stripes. Any truth to that, Kevin? You ever heard?
I don't think so. There have been some studies that have looked at, are there slight differences in fish from different spawning populations? Like, but it tends to be things like, the count of the soft fin rays could maybe be slightly different in some fish spawning populations than others. But when it comes to striped bass and the stripes, I don't think there's anything you can really tell other than how this fish, at some point in development, how its stripes developed. And it's, one of the things with all species of fish, coloration and scale patterns, kind of like the outside appearance of a fish, is one of the most plastic things about a fish. It's most likely to change, to be different, just based on, just to kind of vary in nature. And you see that all the time. You see, if you think of red drum or redfish down in Florida and Southeast coast, most of them have a single spot on the tail that they're kind of known for, but you see all kinds of variation there. Some of them will have, a half dozen spots. I've seen some called leopard drum that are just almost completely spotted. So it's just one of those things. Coloration and in fish, scale patterns like that can change a lot from individual to individual.
So proper fish handling can really help these fish out too. I've seen fish where you can tell like they lost that slime, that protective mucus is what helps keep a lot of these diseases and maladies away from them. That is their first layer of protection against them. So when you handle them, try to do it with wet hands. Try to minimize the handling. There's always people always say keep them in the water as much as possible. Handle them as much as little as possible.
Yeah, and it's also another good reason to do things like use single hooks when possible, use barbless hooks. Be careful when you're unhooking a fish to do it with as little damage as possible. Don't just kind of violently shake the fish to get the hook out of it. You'll see sometimes striped bass that have clearly been caught before.
Yeah, they're kind of missing their.
Yeah, the torn in the corner of the jaw or something like that, or have some kind of deformity around the face. I mean, the good thing is you can see that these fish are fairly, for the most part, a lot of these fish they're tough. They can survive that. They can heal. They can come back, and that's a good sign that catch and release, you're catching that fish again. But anything you can do to kind of minimize that sort of traumatic injury to a fish will make it more likely that that fish survives and goes on to perpetuate the population. So I think it's kind of a good place to just wrap this up of, yeah, the striped bass, see a lot of weird ones, a lot of freaky stuff, skin things, scale things, infections, who knows what. But the one thing we can do is just kind of take care of them on our own and, handle them well, put them back and make sure they swim away healthy and live as full of a life as they can.
And they're not nearly as freaky as many of the fishermen who pursue them. So
yeah, we get a lot of pug nose fishermen too.
All right, if you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to our On the Water YouTube channel. We put out one of these striper season updates every Friday. Thank you for watching this, and good luck this striper season.
And if you catch any weird looking stripers, definitely send some pictures in. We want to see them.